Hello and welcome, Hare Krishna. We are at the Atma Paradigm, and this is session number 3 in part 2 of our series. Today we're looking at physical matter, the hard stuff. And this will introduce you to the continuum of reality. So we're looking at hard matter and subtle information. Now, let's look at what we discussed previously. In our first part on consciousness, we postulated consciousness as being a non-physical, non-material principle. Now, in doing this, we're obviously presenting ourselves in a way that is open to a certain challenge, which we have discussed before. This doubt that consciousness, how can it be non-physical? And the doubt is phrased with these 4 points. And these are not my points, these are the points that are being put against us. This is our challenge. 1, that mind, and you can include consciousness in that because it's often conflated by people, is a non-physical thing. Number 2, the body is a physical thing. 3, that somehow or other the body and the mind and body interact. But 4, physical and non-physical things cannot interact. So how can you have these 4 statements? One of them cannot be true. And generally, this is used to challenge the first of those, that mind and consciousness cannot be a non-physical thing because they do interact, and physical and non-physical things cannot interact. And this is actually the misconception, misapprehension, mistake that is at the heart of physicalist understanding. So today we will be demonstrating how those things which are physical and non-physical actually can interact. And part of the issue is the way people have tried to define physical and non-physical. They basically define them as things that don't interact. So their argument using these 4 points is circular. Whereas what we will demonstrate is that if we have a proper understanding of the physicality of the body and brain, and if we have an understanding of the nature of mind and of consciousness, we will see that they interact rather nicely. So we will be bringing in 4 points that we tried to bring up last week. There was a lot of detail last week, and I really apologize that it was quite packed and intense. But these are the 4 points, and I'm going to break them down a little bit separately. But let me just read through them. The first was that we wanted you to get the idea of properties, that we analyze consciousness, matter, and mind, all in terms of their properties and their functions. And that really the best way to understand these 3 aspects as different types of energy, but they are energy with information. So physical matter is best understood as energy and information manifesting observable properties. We will give that a lot of attention today. Last week we gave our proposition that we accept consciousness and mind and matter all as being individually real. And they're real in the sense that there is something that we interact with in the world out there. And we spent some time last week looking at the principle of oneness and difference. And what we established is that this was really the only ontological framework by which you can analyze the nature of the world. And we will be applying the principles of BHEDABHEDA to explore the relationships and the interactions of these aspects of consciousness, mind, and matter. So let me take you through those 4 just quite quickly. What's a physical object? Well, we tend to think of physical stuff in terms of substance. However, as we explained last week, we really understand everything in terms of what it's like and what it does, i.e. its perceived functions, perceived properties rather, and its functional properties, what it does. So we apply the same principle to the cognitive functions of the mind and to consciousness. We're not trying to analyze them in terms of substance because we cannot even do that with matter. But we can analyze each of them in terms of their properties and functions. And that will show how there is a proper interrelationship. We describe matter as energy and information. So everything that physical matter is composed of is best understood in these terms as energy and information. It's the only valid approach to model physical stuff. Energy which has an information content. And on the basis of the information that an object holds, it exhibits particular properties. So you can model matter, using the idea that you're looking at substance, but at every level, it's actually revealing the properties of what that level of matter is, whether it's material, whether it's molecules, atoms, and once you get down below that, you're really looking at energy and information. And as we quoted last week, subatomic particles really can be best expressed as packets of information located at a point in space. Energy and information. So we're applying the same principle of energy with information to the cognitive functions, whereas we're going to make a slight difference with consciousness as being the observer of information. So consciousness is energy, but it is the energy which observes information and experiences it. Our conclusion on realism, that we accept all facets of reality that we're exploring as real, even though we describe them as energy and information, even though we talk about properties and functions, that doesn't make them any less real than we experience it to be. So there is a real world out there that is being experienced, and that's going to be the subject today. So even if the properties that may be exhibited can come and go, things manifest, they disappear, but still there is something out there to be experienced. So in that sense, we are assigning it as real. It provides the commonality of our experience. So the principles of BHEDABHEDA, these are the 5 principles of this philosophical tool, BHEDABHEDA, difference and oneness and difference, that we need to apply whenever considering the relationship of 2 facets of reality. And the first one is that we accept each of the facets as being real in terms of being actual. We recognize that all aspects of reality share some form of commonality, but at the same time, they have a distinctiveness. So this is the 2 words samanya, which means commonality, vishesha means particularity. And we'll be using those words today and next week as well. Relationships. All elements, the whole and its parts interact. There is a relationship of cause and effect. And one of the key points is a philosophy we know in Sanskrit called Satkaryavad, that the effect is contained within the cause. That will be touched on more in a future talk. And a key one, that linking different facets of reality together, there must be some singular underlying source, an ultimate cause of all these manifestations. Now, what the ontology of that cause and source is, that will be a subject for much, much later. We don't need to explore that now. Rather, our purpose at this stage is to try and get a better understanding of these 3 aspects. And we haven't even started with the physical world yet. So we will be beginning then. So later on, we'll look at what is this unifying cause that holds it all together. But for now, let's look at the properties and the nature of each of these elements. So our response to the challenge of what's called interactionism, how does so-called physical thing and the so-called non-physical thing interact? Our response will include fully understanding the nature and properties of each aspect and exploring and explaining how these different properties interrelate one to another. And we will establish how the properties of each may arise from a common source or an underlying causal form of reality. There is only one reality. There can only be one source of that reality. But it is illogical to say that the one reality is undifferentiated when we know from all our experience that it is. So the absolute reality must be such that it can accommodate and handle all of the plurality we know of, and probably so much more. So let's put a box around our three facets of consciousness, mind, and the outside world. This yellow box, that represents the source of all reality, that which encompasses and holds everything else together. Okay? So that's our, this yellow box will appear a lot today. In fact, we'll start with it just on its own. So we're using this box to indicate the extent of a singular source that encompasses all of the features we wish to explore. So for now, we want to explore the model that each of the functions will be manifest within this box. So let's think of it like this. Think of reality within this box as a continuum of energy, if you like, or of many interrelated fields. And we'll talk a little bit what we mean by a field, but something with properties and functions. So there's a continuum, just like a spectrum, how we think of one spectrum of electromagnetic radiation or energy, but it seems to manifest different properties at different parts of its spectrum or its wavelengths. Now that's just an illustration. We're not saying that reality is just a vibration and like that. What we're saying is that there seems to be a spectrum of reality manifesting different properties. Those we know of in terms of consciousness, those we know in terms of matter. So let's stick the physical realm at one end of our continuum. Okay, so one of these, the fields that manifest in this continuum, is the physical realm. Okay, reality as observable properties. And at the other end, another aspect of the continuum exists as the phenomenon and property of consciousness. And of course, being facets of the same all-embracing reality, there can be a natural relationship and interaction between both of them. We'll have to explain what that is and how it works, but it's a reasonable postulation on the basis of this model. So there's an interaction between both consciousness and the physical realm. Consciousness is the observer and experience of information, and we will be showing the nature of the physical realm as information manifesting properties. But that interaction between the two is facilitated by what we have previously called the interface. We have, and we've used this word mind, and we've always put it in inverted commas because it's rather vague, but at least you know that's roughly where it belongs. So at times today you'll see cognitive interface, cognitive functions, mind will appear on different slides. And it's this interface that is helping us, consciousness, connect with the physical realm. So, however, today we are going to start with the subject matter of the physicality of the world outside. Now, the physical science believes that they're exploring the nature of substance, but as we've said, ends up ascribing properties to subatomic things we cannot see or touch, other than observe their relationships and interactions. So we end up giving the smallest bits of what we think matter, physical matter, is made of. We call these particles, but actually they're no longer particles. They're just things that we have described in terms of their properties, so that we can explain what we see them doing with those properties. So if we look at this, that we work with the first idea that the world is describable as properties and model it on the properties that link back to consciousness. That would be our approach. Because look at this. Here's the periodic table. Now, it's a wonderful example of oneness and difference in terms of samanya and vishesha. If you look at the blue, the one that's highlighted with the blue box from, those are elements, so-called elements, that have similar number of electron shells. Whereas the red ones are particularly interesting because they show columns of elements that exhibit similar chemical properties even though they're all distinctive. So there's a Samanya and a Vishesha throughout the different matrix of the periodic table. And we call them elements. Why? Not because they're not made of something else. We call them elements because they exhibit elementary properties, particularly when we're looking at things as atoms, and as in the periodic table, we're taking an atom as the smallest thing that represents the chemical properties of that substance or that thing. So even atoms are described in terms of the properties, their chemical properties that they exhibit. And of course, when you go below that, you're getting into very weird stuff with electrons and quarks and everything else. So we end up defining the constituents of physical stuff in terms of things composed of energy, things that contain information, and things understood in terms of their properties. This is really important. And this is not a criticism. It's valid. This is a proper, valid analysis of what science is doing. We're not complaining that it's not dealing with substance. We're just pointing out it's actually dealing with properties. However, by choosing the properties that you want to look at in terms of chemistry and physics, you could be missing out on other properties which exist and are exhibited by physical reality. And one which is very, very important, how this is experienced by consciousness. Now let me show you this next one. This chart will build up, but it's to compare the analysis of the physical world in terms of the atom as described in physics, and the Paramanu, which is often translated from Sanskrit as the atom, but has a completely different kind of connotation, but being the smallest fundamental particle of matter. But it has a very different, it is not equivalent to the atom of physics. Now, there are some kind of crossovers. And first of all, if you think of matter as particles, well, the pre-modern idea, kind of up to the beginning of the 20th century, was that the atom was a particle, an object, a hard thing, was the smallest thing. Yes, it contained some electrons, but they were maybe stuck in it, you know, kind of like a plum pudding. And this idea of that there was a different atom for every different kind of chemical type persisted for a while. So this is very similar to the Vaisheshika idea. The Vaisheshika is one of the Vedic darshans. It's a kind of school of wisdom which tries to analyze the particle nature of the physical world. So it had the idea that the Paramanu was as a particle. Now, the more modern age then looked at atom as a packet of information at a point. So matter as energy and information. And the interesting aspect that this kind of matches, there are differences, you know, in exactly what they each are looking at, but there is a parallel that the Sankhya philosophy, another of the Vedic darshans, is looking at the Paramanu as a unit of data and properties. And we will give much more information on that later. Now, the difference between how the Paramanu is modeled in both Vaisheshika and Sankhya compared to that in physics is the properties that you are looking for at that level. Now, in physics, really the old atom was looking at chemical properties. Now we're looking at the atom and what it's composed of to try and understand physics properties. And whereas both Vaisheshika was looking at the physical sensory properties, what this atom gave rise to in terms of our experience, and similarly with Sankhya, what are the sensory properties we're experiencing from the manifestation of these Paramanus? And they think this is a very different way of modeling the nature of matter, and you're looking for two different things. There's nothing wrong with looking at the chemical properties and physics properties if that's what you want to do, and it's really important for technology, engineering, and biochemistry, a lot, very important. However, what you will find by doing that is that you won't find consciousness and mental functions. You end up looking at stuff and properties which have no seeming causal relationship to that of consciousness. There seems to be no way to tie them together. Whereas the way of Sankhya analyzing its fundamental unit, which reveals how it produces the sensory properties which relate to consciousness and mental functions, that's a different process. And in many ways, it seems a very sensible process, particularly if what your target is trying to understand the nature of consciousness and its interaction with the world around us. So what we're suggesting is that the best way to analyze physical reality and to understand consciousness and its perception is to analyze the world in terms of its ability to manifest the properties experienced by conscious awareness. So for consciousness studies, these are the properties that are important. And they can't be found. We can't find that link. We can't find the relationship through the study of chemistry and physics separately from this. We're not saying that chemistry and physics aren't important, but you might as well link them together with a modeling of reality which gives you consciousness. Then you've kind of got everything. So the problem is that we take for granted that the substance of stuff gives rise to their perceived properties. Now that's natural, but it's not quite right. And we have to remind ourselves of the problem that we talked about in the first series, qualia. You remember qualia. It's the qualities of our inner awareness, the qualities of our mental experience. And we did a lot of analysis on this. For instance, we talked about colors, and we showed that although you can think that you can explain color by the physicality of light and wavelength, that actually the colors we experience aren't fully related to light. And we can even experience colors without any light being involved in our minds. So this shows that there is a disconnect between the physical properties and our experience. For instance, sound. We show a little picture here of a kind of an M3 player, you know, and the channels of the waves that are produced by maybe a song or something. But why does this digital information, when it's like that, or when it gets to our brains, why does it sound like a sound? This was the hard problem of consciousness. Or one of the most difficult, actually, is the physical thing of smelling. Why do the chemicals which connect with our nose, and we don't fully understand exactly what's going on? It's not that it's a chemical reaction. It seems like it's what's sometimes called a key and lock arrangement. It's the shape of the molecule that seems to be fitting into a receptor and setting off that little bleep of biochemical electricity which goes to our brain. But why is that bleep experienced as a smell, where another one coming from our ear is experienced as a sound, another is experienced as a color, another as a taste? This is what we don't understand. We're not able to tie the properties of physics and chemistry back to our experience. Hence, we need to have a process for modeling the external world in how it presents itself to us. Now, let's think about this little apple here. So we've got an apple. It's got its color and form, and it's nice to touch. It's got a weight and kind of heaviness and a texture to it. It's got a smell. It's nice and fresh, and when you bite into it, there's a taste, and there's also that wonderful crunching sound that is produced. So, and the apple has all these different sensory properties. It's got auditory properties, tactile, visual, gustatory, and olfactory properties. all just wrapped up in that one little object. So what we're suggesting is that there must be some information inside the apple which specifies each of those properties of experience. And those properties must go all the way down to its fundamental unit, the paramanu. If we dissect that apple according to its molecules, down to its atoms, down to its quarks, we don't find any of those sensory properties. We are not able to link them together. So the properties we experience as qualia are so different to the nature of data, information, and the properties of the physicality of objects, and even how that is produced and processed in the brain, that we need to look at these as kind of elemental in their own way. Now, this idea that there's some underlying data or information which specifies properties actually is now pretty commonplace, because we now have, as in the picture, we can take a scanner, which this is a 3D scanner scanning this little model on the turntable to the right there. So it's basically turning the form of that little statue into digital data. And we know we can go the opposite way. We can take digital data, and this is the kind of STL format, standard tessellation language, and we can use that data in order to send it to a 3D printer and print out the object again. So the idea that data can produce the properties, in this case the form or the colors of something, that's well understood. And there's now lots of fun that's been had with these 3D printers using data visualization. And basically, I just use this example because they are examples of data sets. Like, for instance, the keyboard one is the number of times different keys are pressed. You can put that into an Excel spreadsheet perhaps, and then put it into turn it into data for 3D printing, and that's what comes out. The one of the map in the world is looking at some kinds of disparity in some kind of social circumstances, but it's taking data and producing a three-dimensional object from it. And then the one on the right is these are sound walls, where someone has taken sound and used them to create the ripples that represent those sounds, and then frozen it or solidified it on an exhibition wall. So this way we can understand how information and properties, in this case we're doing a lot of visual properties, but other properties as well, can be manifest from their underlying data. And of course this has some relevance and resonance in quantum physics. Now, it's a big subject. It's details obviously beyond my pay grade, but from what is generally presented, we can understand that quantum physics looks at matter in a similar fashion. I'm not trying to create a one-to-one relationship here. I'm not saying that what we're looking at in terms of this is the quantum stuff. No, that's another way of modeling the world. I'm just showing that there are different ways of modeling reality, and particularly with quantum physics, you get down to information. Let me explain how it works. So quantum physics proposes that our observance of physical matter reveals a particular manifestation of that object. And that manifestation is just one possible manifestation of its properties out of many other possibilities. And the set of possibilities of how an object might manifest to our observation is a set of information called its probability function. So it's been typical until recently to say that an object, like some subatomic particle, electron, photon, quark, whatever, is real only when it is observable, i.e. when we can measure and see some of its physical properties. But these things seem to come in and out of existence. So Until recently, they would only be considered real if they're actually manifesting properties. But that's a bias. That's a real bias against whatever state it is in when it is not manifesting those observable properties. So there's a new breed of quantum physicists like Sean Carroll of Caltech who challenge this. And they want equal status for the underlying information state, the probability function. They want that to be also to be called a real state as well. That it is not just when there's manifest properties, but the information that manifests those properties as one option should also be called real. And in fact, Sean Carroll goes further. He says that maybe the underlying state is more real because it is the source, it's the base, it's what gives, provides the information that's able to manifest the particularity of what we call the properties of a particle. So all I'm saying with this is that there's a similar principle at work in the Sankhya system. And we're going to borrow on the Sankhya system now to help us with our modeling of physical reality. So the key point of the Sankhya model is that that stuff we call physical matter, the stuff that we pick up and play with and eat and do all sorts of stuff with all day long, our bodies, our brains, everything that makes up this world around us, it exists as both the hard stuff. Now, the hard stuff has got different meaning in Ireland, but what I mean for here is the hard stuff, that which manifests physical properties and is tangibly, the physical properties are tangibly experienced by our senses. But there's also soft or subtle stuff, stuff that we don't see, we don't observe directly. But the subtle stuff is that which contains, and we're going to use this word, proto-physical. I'm borrowing that word from other philosophy contexts. So that which contains the proto-physical data that specifies the observable properties of the hard stuff. So there's two things there. The experience of physical matter is therefore due to the combination of two fields in our model: physical properties and proto-physical information. So our analysis is looking at different sets of properties, those giving rise to experiencing properties of an object. And we're looking that the properties are specified by the information which is defining them. Now, in Sankhya, these are described as the TANMATRAS and the MAHABHUTAS, and then useful terminology to use. So if you like, the hard stuff, the stuff that we consider to be matter that we are interacting with, this is what we're really interacting with, is the physical properties of the MAHABHUTAS. These are manifest material elements. This is our experience of their properties. They're physical properties, observable, and to our senses we can interact with them. And these physical properties manifest two types of sensory properties. General, which are called Swarup, and particular, Stula, sensory properties. Don't need to worry about that so much for the moment. So we are interacting with the observable properties of the MAHABHUTAS. But these properties of the MAHABHUTAS only exist because they're being specified by the proto-physical information within that object. These relate to what are called the TANMATRAS. And the TANMATRAS are subtle sense qualities that give rise to the various sensory properties that we experience. These are the shukshma. These are the subtle or underlying subtle qualities that define the physical properties of an object. So if we kind of look at it like this, there's sensory properties such as the auditory, the sound, tactile, touch, visual, form and color, gustatory, taste, olfactory, the smell, the aromas and fragrance of things. The key point to appreciate about each of these is that they are elemental. They are each unique and distinct. They each deserve their own subcategory of experience or sensory properties. So, the sensory properties of qualia are irreducible to one another. So also are the observable properties. So there are subcategories of hard stuff, and subcategories of the properties manifest in hard stuff. And also there's subcategories of the proto-physical information that give rise to these unique properties. And you can probably break it down in different ways, but Sankhya breaks them down as those five, that there are 5 sets of key properties which are elemental, and therefore five Mahabhutas manifest them, and therefore there are 5 sets of proto-physical Tanmatra information that specify each of those. Now, properties, information, and their substrate. Sensory properties manifest an object to us. Those properties are specified by underlying proto-physical information. This requires a substrate that we talked about last week, that what holds properties together within an object. If the object is simply properties, there isn't another substance that it's made of. It is composed of the properties and information, but it is information which is held on a substrate. So there has to be a substrate, the bearer of both the properties and the information. So this system enables information to manifest physical properties. Now, this is a very different way to conceiving of the nature of what you're experiencing in your everyday life. But it is absolutely standard within the scientific analysis. So we're going to use the idea of a field, not a field of green thing with green grass and cows wandering through it, but as a field in physics. And a field in physics is a region in which each point is affected by a force. Or you could say a field is a physical quantity that has a value for each point in space and time. So drawn a couple of diagrams here just to give you an idea that basically there's a kind of grid. And this is conceptual. This is conceptual. But the idea is that once you have a grid and you apply different values to different points on the grid, you build up something which can then be, which then has a kind of three-dimensional manifestation. So this is an understanding how a substrate, such as a grid, can take on data, and by the data becoming embedded on the grid, a physical property can become manifest. And this is the process that is at work through in Sankhya. So this next bit, again, it's illustrative. You know, it's just to kind of get this idea of how information on a grid turns into physicality. It's just to get that concept across to us. So here we have a grid. It's, you know, in these different lines. So all the data is set to zeros, so nothing is manifest. However, if we add some information, now this data, each of these sets of 5 digits represents the data points starting from the rows which are on my left and your left rather, and move back to the top of the screen. So you can see I've now put little sticks representing the digits, whether it's a 2, 1, 3 or a 4 at the different points. Okay, so that is the information now sitting on the grid. And what happens is that this is starting to you know, if you start linking them together and they start working together. So at a very small level, you can have all these different points, but together they start to form something which is taking shape and becoming deeper and deeper. Now, I'm showing this kind of in stages just to give you an idea of how the property of form is emerging from data on this grid. But actually, the whole thing is simultaneously existing. You can't have one without the other. The properties and the data exist as one. It is another example of oneness and difference. There's a difference between the data and the property, but actually they are absolutely as one in terms of how the manifestation works. So what this tells us about physical stuff. The two key aspects to what we think of as physical stuff are that there are elements which are the physical manifestation of observable properties. And that's how we're understanding elements, that they are manifesting different observable properties. And there are TANMATRAS, which is the proto-physical state of information inhered on a field grid. So we have the properties manifested and the information. Now, in doing this, and this is a little detail which is going to become important as we look at the situation next week. But one of the Mahabhuta elements that we want to give a little bit of extra significance to is the first of them. This is the element Akash. It's sometimes called the information field, it's sometimes called ether, sky, and it manifests the property of space. So the first thing that needs to be manifest as a property is space, that which can accommodate all other elements and all other aspects of material reality. And the interesting thing is that that is manifested from the first of the TANMATRAS, which is identified as subtle sound, the TANMATRA of Shabda. So this is the first TANMATRA, and why we give it special status is because this TANMATRA of Shabda contains all the proto-physical data required to specify all the other TANMATRAs, all the other information states, and all the other properties of all the elements. Everything is included within sound. So there is a oneness and difference connection between sound, Akash, the other TANMATRAs and the other elements. But they manifest different properties. So therefore there is particularity and difference existing within physical stuff, which of course is what we enjoy about the world. This kind of that there are so many different objects and so many different ways of experiencing and enjoying it. But together, this manifests what we call the physical stuff. Now, we're going to take that as one field, the proto-physical physical field, okay? It's what makes up the physical stuff. It's got its hard stuff, the physical other elements, and it's got the soft stuff or subtle stuff, the TANMATRA's information. And we need to understand that, and we are putting our cognitive functions as another field. It's another type of stuff that is manifesting the properties of cognition and mind, which we're going to analyze next week. And then for now, and I think it's a simple way of doing it, we look at consciousness as its own discrete function and property. So these are our three fields manifesting within this continuum. Now, what we're going to analyze is the nature of the interaction of consciousness with the proto-physical and physical. And really what that is all about is a flow of information. Now you can model what happens in different ways, but one simple way to understand it is that there is a flow of the information contained within the observable properties of physical matter, which actually belong to the TANMATRAs, which flow through the mind to us. And I'm hoping that by today we've understood that whatever information is manifest in the physical things we observe, that information is contained within its TANMATRAs in different ways. And all of the information of the TANMATRAs is contained within the Akash as sound, shabda. So basically we can gather all the information we need, and it can be contained and accessible within sound in the Akash. And of course, Krishna draws specific reference to this when he says Shabda K, I am the sound in ether. Now, that's where we are at the moment. We've got all the information that specifies the observable properties in physical stuff, and now represented as the information present within the subtle sense qualities of the Tanmatras, specifically as sound in Akash. We've got our information up to this point. Next week, we now have to explore the cognitive functions. We need to see how that information within sound and the Tanmatras is being read and passed to the cognitive functions. And then how the cognitive functions process that information as mental content and as storage, and how there is preparation of part of that information in a format suitable for the presentation to consciousness. So that is where we're going next week. Now, I'll just give a little summary, but this is a good opportunity. If there's any questions, please send them to on the Facebook page, and Mantiraj in Cardiff will pass them to me. So, our summary for today. And I apologize that again, a lot of detail, a lot of information, a lot of new concepts. But the talk, of course, is available both on Facebook and YouTube for watching again. On Facebook, we also are able to upload the slides, so you can read all the slides, even with all their misprints, on Facebook. But a summary. So, what we call reality is modeled as information, energy and information, manifesting diverse properties and function. And we have placed it as a continuum. And the analysis of the physical stuff focuses on the sensory properties which link to perception by consciousness. That we're actually interested in, why do we have the phenomenal experience of qualia? There has to be something that is inherent within the physicality that gives rise to that particular phenomenal experience. And we cannot find the link between matter and qualia if we simply regard matter in terms of molecules, atoms, and quantum stuff. We can't find it. But we can find it if we model the world in terms of its sensory properties. And physical stuff is then understood as the effect. The hard stuff is the effect of proto-physical information, giving rise to the manifestation of objects, and particularly the properties that those objects manifest. Because we only understand an object in terms of the properties that it offers us to interact with. What do our senses pick up? That's the only way we understand an object. And it is inherent proto-physical information that specifies the particular sensory properties of any object. So next week we'll be looking at how to take that further and understand what happens to information within the cognitive functions. So we've got some questions. Let me just see if I can pull them up. Now, a question about Sankhya, that there's issues that one of the schools, one of the darshans, particularly involving on Sankhya, is considered to be a physicalist theory, because it tries to say that whatever is producing the forms of matter is physical, and that's all in all. The problem with that particular system, it doesn't interact and is not consistent with the understanding of consciousness. It's very useful for a breakdown of elements in certain ways, but we do not accept the physicalist Sankhya because it is rejected by Vedanta, and it's rejected by Vedanta as being non-Vedic. I.e., it doesn't match the other ideas of Vedanta. It doesn't establish the primacy of consciousness, and particularly the source of all consciousness. So the Sankhya philosophy that I will be giving you is drawn from one of the Puranas, particularly the Srimad Bhagavatam, because that is consistent with Vedanta, and it offers the most clear and most comprehensive understanding of the nature of our ontology. A lot of, for a lot of the details that we're looking at, there may not seem to be very much difference, but when you get into the bigger picture, there is certainly a very big difference. I think that's all the questions that I'm receiving at the moment. I'm not sure if how the YouTube system works for questions, but we're ready to kind of let you know about next week. We'll be exploring the cognitive functions, how the amazing features, particularly of persona, intelligence, and mind, work. So please join us next week, same time, 6 p.m. UK time. That's Thursday, the 9th of July. Thank you very much. Again, I apologize. Many kind of new ideas and terminology. Not all of them are required to be fully memorized. And I will always introduce you to the key things that we need at any one point and make sure that there's a proper recap. So even if you're finding this a little difficult, a little challenging to remember it all, don't worry. You can still follow all the different ideas as we keep going through. But thank you very much. I'll take your leave. Hare Krishna and good night.